Hello, my name is Charles, and I would like to welcome you to my channel. This is the first English video, or proper English video, that I'm making on it, and it is a detailed look at the current situation of the pad, or the controller, on Gran Turismo 7 as of 2025. I should explain that I am a long-time pad player of the Gran Turismo series, and I felt compelled to make this video because right now the pad is in a particularly difficult situation. It has a number of problems that haven't been addressed for a while, and I feel that the first step towards getting those problems addressed is putting them out there and making them clear. There's been a lot of discourse lately, and a lot of misunderstanding, I would say, regarding these problems and where they come from, and that becomes apparent when you watch other YouTubers talk about the pad in GT7. Not that many of them talk about it in the first place, but when they do, many of them say that there's something wrong with the pad, and that on certain car and track combinations it seems to be very slow for some reason, but they can't quite pinpoint what the problem is and what's causing it. So before we set off on this troubleshooting journey, if you will, there's a couple of disclaimers I'd like to make. First off, some of the things I say in this video will have already been laid out in my joystick guide, a grand sort of community project consisting of a written document where I talk about everything there is to know about the pad in Gran Turismo, how to get better on it, and also what some of its issues are. This document is constantly reviewed and improved with the help of some of the best pad players in Spain. You can see them and their socials over here. And I should note that this video is not in itself a guide on how to be good on a pad in Gran Turismo, but it might end up helping anyway. Now, disclaimer number 2. Everything I say here applies to all eligible pads for Gran Turismo 7. So it includes the DualShock 4, the DualSense Edge, and any other licensed PlayStation controller. As a final disclaimer, we should probably clear up some of the terminology that I'll be using from this point on. You may know that there are 3 options for steering on a pad in Gran Turismo 7. The first being the directional buttons, or the arrow keys, as I like to call them. The second being the joystick, and the third being the motion sensor, or the gyroscope. I'll be grouping up the arrow keys and the joystick under the generic term joystick for this video, because the two of them share a lot of design elements, and with it a lot of the same problems, and I'll be keeping the sensor and the wheel sort of separate from that. So be very, very careful when I use the term joystick. Mind that I'm referring to either the joystick or the directional buttons, and also be very careful when I use the term pad as a generic term. When I do, I'm probably talking about the joystick as well. Right then, some context to get us going. Out of the 3 steering options for the controller on GT7, I would argue that joystick is by far the most popular, purely because the motion sensor and the directional buttons are both a little bit difficult to use and very difficult to master. So combine that with the fact that most of the community doesn't have a steering wheel, and what you get is a player base that is probably made up of at least 70 or 80% joystick players. This is huge because it means that if the joystick develops a problem or has something unintended, like a bug, that bug will affect the vast majority of people who play GT7. When the game released, the physics engine was very different from the one we had in GT Sport. Cars felt super different to drive, and most of them were generally more difficult to drive. Too difficult in the eyes of some people, which eventually caused Polyphony to sort of back down on that a little bit and revert the physics to a state that was a lot more similar to GT Sport. Now, this first change actually came with some changes to the pad, if I'm not mistaken, and it resulted in the pad enduring a pretty rough 5 or 6 months where it just wasn't very responsive, and it clearly lacked a lot of pace. Now, a while later, in about September of 2022, it was fixed manually by Polyphony, and then it experienced a sort of neutral era for several years, where not much changed about it, until July of 2024, when update 1.49 came along, the Spec 2 update that introduced many things, including Eager Nordwand. 1.49 was another major physics change for Gran Turismo 7, so completely different car handling, a new model for tire temperature, for suspension, a lot of things changed. And with it, the pad changed. More specifically, the joystick and the directional buttons got a new steering algorithm in an effort to give them better handling and to give them a fighting chance under this new physics engine. Now, In the first few weeks after the update came out, the other pad players and I weren't really sure whether the joystick had improved or not. We couldn't tell yet because we didn't have enough information. But then, over time, it started to become clear that something had happened to the joystick. We couldn't yet tell what it was or where it manifested, but it was clear that something was just not right about it. This carried on for a while until a couple of months later, one day, I was testing out the joystick and the wheel on various different combos, and I decided to go to Blue Moon Bay Speedway for the Circuit Experience Challenge. There, I was treated to this absolute monstrosity. A full lap of this track is realistically just 2 corners, the first and the last. And despite that, with this particular car, the pad ends up being half a second slower than the wheel. So let's find out what exactly is going on here. The way I see it, the joystick has 2 types of problems in the game right now. The big ones and the little ones. Now, the big ones are the ones that were brought in by 1.49, and the little ones have always been there and are not quite as troublesome. So let's get going with the big ones, starting with whatever the hell we've just witnessed around Blue Moon Bay. This is my steering input on a wheel when conducting this test, and this is my input on the pad. As you can see, for some reason the joystick is turning a lot less, even though I'm turning it all the way. Now, why does this happen? Well, when you're playing on a steering wheel, you have to figure out the ideal amount of steering yourself. You have to use force feedback, and overall you have to decide how much you want to turn the wheel depending on the corner. On a pad, it's a lot simpler because the game does it for you. The controller's steering algorithm calculates the optimal amount of steering so as not to exceed the tire's grip, and when you turn the joystick all the way, or almost all the way, it provides that steering for you. The problem is, in this particular situation, the algorithm is not providing me all the steering that I need. Now, when and where does this manifest? I've heard a lot of people theorize that the main issue for the pad is fast corners and that it loses a lot of time on them, but this isn't entirely true, because even though there are many fast corners where the pad loses time, there are also others where it loses no time at all. If you look at the Porsche curves, for example, some of the fastest in the game, the pad actually fares very well with those. And if you look at tracks rather than single corners, you'll end up seeing that Tokyo Expressway, for example, which is littered with fast corners, is actually an excellent track for the pad. The issue doesn't lie in the type of corner, but rather in the profile of the road itself. More specifically, in dips, bankings, and other surfaces that force the car towards the ground and cause the suspension to compress heavily. In real life, when a race car goes over one of these surfaces, it gains grip because it gets shoved towards the tarmac, and so the driver has to compensate by steering more than usual through the corner. It is this extra steering that the joystick doesn't have access to in the game. Now, this disparity between wheel steering and pad steering doesn't affect every car the same way. A car like the Aston Martin DBR9 I was driving just a moment ago, which has a very heavy front end and just requires a lot of steering, is obviously going to be very affected on the pad. But take, for example, a car like the Ferrari 458, mid-engined, very tail-happy, doesn't require you to work the wheel quite as much. That's going to be a lot less affected on the pad, and it's going to have less of a disadvantage. I actually tested every single Group 3 and Group 4 car on the Blue Moon Oval to see how much the pad suffered from this issue with each one of them, and these are the results I got. Now, if we take the Ferrari 458 that I was mentioning just a moment ago, and check its lap times, we'll see that it actually managed a pretty similar lap on a pad than it did on the wheel. Now, does this mean that this car is as good on a joystick as it is on a wheel, full stop? Well, you'd be forgiven for saying yes, but the answer, unfortunately, is still no. You see, it is one thing to go over a dip or a banking with very nice and smooth tarmac, and it is a whole nother to go over a bump. Take the 458 to a track like the Nürburgring Nordschleife, which is full of bumps, and you'll find yourself losing a lot of time, particularly on the very bumpy corners, like the 2 carousels. Here's a clip of me in a recent Manufacturers Cup race, losing so much time and having to go so slowly through the second carousel, the one near the back straight, that I get hit by the car behind and actually sustain damage. This issue only accentuates when you pick a car that is very low to the ground and therefore bottoms out very easily when going over bumps. Take the Red Bull X29, for example. I reckon that thing doesn't lose a couple of tenths through the carousel. I reckon it loses about a second. I'm not entirely sure what causes this issue, or what exactly went wrong with the steering algorithm that makes the joystick lose so much time when going over bumps. But I heard a pretty interesting theory on it just the other day. I was watching Sammy Snake's interview with Calster, who's one of the best pad players in the world, and during that interview, which by the way is pretty informative, you should go check it out, Calster brings up a very interesting point about bumps. He reckons that when you go over a bump on the joystick, the game for some reason thinks you're off the track, and in an effort to stop you from spinning yourself out, it resets your steering. This makes a ton of sense. Now, just to recap a little bit, the joystick's main issue is made up of two sub-issues. On the one hand, it loses a lot of time over dips, bankings, and other areas where the suspension compresses heavily because the steering algorithm does not provide enough degrees. It does not provide enough steering. Full stop. And on the other hand, it loses a lot of time over bumps and when the car bottoms out because the algorithm reacts to them in a weird way, be it by resetting the steering or by doing something else that we just don't have enough information to know. Now, both of these issues are only present since 1.49. They were not present before that update, and they make the pad extremely track dependent. Basically, the flatter a track is, the better it is for the pad, and the bumpier it is, the worse. And something else that should be noted is that, of course, both of these little issues manifest and exacerbate differently depending on what car you're driving. Another important talking point that I haven't brought up until now is that neither of these issues affects the motion sensor. Clearly, the game takes its inputs differently and almost treats it like a wheel, and so it doesn't suffer from this. So for any pad players who are struggling on a joystick, the solution for now, while this is worked on and fixed, the solution could be to just switch to sensor, because again, it doesn't have these problems. Now, when it comes to potential fixes, I don't really know what to suggest. I obviously don't know how the algorithm works, but considering that before Spec 2, before 1.49, we didn't have these issues, we didn't have this sort of compression nightmare that we have now, perhaps we could just go back to the algorithm we had before Spec 2. Perhaps that would be a quick solution. However, because that update has changed many things about the physics, and particularly the tire temperatures, I'm not sure if this would be possible. Still, I would like to suggest it as a solution because Spec 2 has undoubtedly been a downgrade for the pad. And it's frustrating. As a joystick player who does a lot of league racing and knows other joystick players who do it as well, it's annoying to see the pad take such a hit from an update, to the point where it feels the same or perhaps a little bit better on a small minority of combos, clearly worse on the majority of them, and a downright disaster on some. We just know we're racing at a handicap on most combos right now, and considering the kind of people we usually race against, we cannot afford that. So that covers the big problems of the pad on Gran Turismo 7, but I would also like to talk about the little ones, which, as I said earlier, have always been there. 1.49 didn't necessarily change them, though it did make one of them a little bit worse for a while. Now, what I'm talking about here when it comes to smaller issues is mainly input speed. More specifically, the rate at which the game reads and executes your inputs from the pad, throttle, brake, and steering. Because the pad is a smaller and simpler device than the wheel, it tends to struggle with being fine, with being precise with your inputs. And so, most racing games employ a tactic where they automatically smoothen the pad's inputs to aid the player a little bit. So for example, let's say R2 is your throttle button. You push down on the trigger all the way, but by the time you've reached 100% pressure on the controller, the game is not at 100% throttle yet. It's smoothing out your transitioning from 0 to 100%. And the same goes for the steering. For example, you turn the joystick all the way to the left, but the game does not turn in as quickly as you've turned in on the joystick itself. In other words, again, it smoothens your transition from no steering to full steering. The exact parameters of this can often be changed in many games. F1, for example, has linearity, saturation, and other things that the player can adjust to actually decide how much the game meddles with their inputs. But Gran Turismo is a bit different. It's somewhat limited in this respect. Its only real adjustment for this, its only configuration, is the steering sensitivity. And although that is very perceptible and that makes a pretty major change and therefore is a good point for customization, other than that, there isn't very much you can do to customize what the game does with your inputs. And so in this respect, Gran Turismo is pretty neutral and at the same time pretty limited. It's very easy to pick up on a pad, and in my opinion, it is very, very easy to become good on a pad in Gran Turismo, but that comes at the cost of a very low performance ceiling caused by very sluggish throttle, brake, and steering inputs. This is most felt through chicanes and through other corners that just force the pad to go from one end of the steering spectrum to the other. That is what it struggles with, particularly with certain cars. Now, after 1.49, the pad struggled with this on pretty much all cars, but in update 1.55, this was hotfixed. And with high downforce cars, think the Gran Turismo F3500A, for example, the joystick now responds quite a bit better. However, with cars that are quick but don't actually have a lot of downforce, think the Hyundai N2025 Vision Gran Turismo, which is a car that I feel doesn't have that much downforce, or at least over body downforce, the joystick is very slow on the inputs. It still goes from right to left and from left to right super, super slowly, and that is why the pad was so slow on the recent time trial we had at Spa-Francorchamps with that car. It was just terrible over the chicanes, not to mention, obviously, the car bottomed out over the bumps, and that's an entirely separate issue, which we've discovered already. So to recap this part of the problem, the joystick and the directional buttons have very sluggish steering inputs, certainly more sluggish than they used to be, and as a result, they really struggle through chicanes and with certain types of cars. Now, the car is very, very influential here. On some cars, the steering feels absolutely fine, and on others, it's almost inexplicable how sluggish it is. So that obviously needs looking into because it is once again damaging the pad on quite a number of car and track combos. I don't recall this being an issue on GT Sport, and in fact, back then, I would say that on tracks with a lot of chicanes, the pad didn't struggle, it excelled. That was part of the reason why I started to like Mount Panorama so much, for example. That crazy downhill section with all the chicanes, that segment was particularly good for the pad because of how quick its direction changes were. Nowadays, it's the complete opposite. Between those chicanes and all the bumps and bits of compression, that part of Mount Panorama is terrible for the pad. I don't want this video to be any longer than it needs to be. And plus, at this point, I've pretty much said everything I need to say, so let's not beat the dead horse too much. And yeah, basically, at this point, know that the pad is in a very precarious situation, and above that, it's in a very inconsistent situation. Whereas back then, pad players, or joystick players, rather, had a fighting chance on pretty much any combo, nowadays their chances are limited. On some combos, they can still put up a fight, and on others, they just have no shot. You might argue that since the motion sensor isn't affected by the issues that I've presented here, perhaps pad players could just switch to it, and that way they would be able to compete. But I think you'll agree with me when I say that that's a bit of a desperate solution, seeing as the motion sensor is very awkward to use. I mean, you have to hold up the controller in front of you. It's tiring. It really isn't good for long races, so I wouldn't really blame anyone for not wanting to switch to sensor. Joystick and the arrow keys are just so much easier to use, and I think they should be as competitive as the sensor. You shouldn't be forced to drive on a pseudo wheel to be good at the game. I hope most of the things that I've presented here can be addressed and properly fixed in the future, be it later on in GT7's life cycle or in time for the release of Gran Turismo 8. Either way, the first step towards actually getting this fixed would be to acknowledge it under known issues. The pad has been like this for well over a year. These issues have been haunting us for like 14 months at this point, ever since July of 2024, and so it would be nice to at least have them acknowledged in this segment. Now, the fact that this hasn't been acknowledged as a problem has driven some people to speculate that it's intentional, and that this is, perhaps this is the developers willingly holding back the pad, but I don't believe this to be true, or at least I don't want to believe this to be true, because of how inconsistent the pad is. It's one thing to keep the pad just a tiny little bit below the wheel, give it a little bit of a performance ceiling that is almost imperceptible. It's a whole nother to make it as weird and as borderline broken as it is now. Surely this is intended, but this cannot be intended. So that'll be it for me. Thank you very much for joining me on this one. It's actually been a lot of fun making a video in English for a change. And if you're a pad player on GT7 and you're struggling, but you can't tell why, if you're missing those, 3, 4, 5 tenths a lap, and you can't put your finger on what the problem is, this might be the problem. So just hang in there, and in the future, you might get those tenths back. So yeah, basically that's it from me. Thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.